Hello class, welcome to 3D Design. My name is Bill. I'll be the instructor of this online 3D course this semester. The intent of this presentation is to give you a quick overview in Cinema 4D and talk about some of the basic conventions. Now at this point I expect that you've had an opportunity to review the syllabus, to go to the discussion board and introduce yourself, and also to download your student version of Cinema 4D. So make sure that you do all of those things, launch Cinema 4D, and we'll get started. And I'll get started by giving you a quick tour of the Cinema 4D interface and a little bit about the workflow before we get started in our first project. So here I am, I've launched Cinema 4D and I'm looking at the interface for Cinema 4D. And directly in the center view, this is our perspective viewport. And our perspective viewport is where all the magic is going to happen inside Cinema 4D. Just beneath the perspective viewport, we have a truncated timeline, and we also have our material manager. We'll talk more about those when the time is right. At the top of the window on the right side, we have this command bar that allows us to create different kinds of content in our 3D space. Just to the left of this bar, we have some render settings here, and then we have some other tools that allow us to move, scale, and rotate content in our perspective view. On the left side, we have our components menu, and we'll quickly jump into this menu in the first project, and this allows us to break down our 3D objects into the different component types. Over on the right side of the menu, we have our object manager, and you'll see very soon that when we start creating content, this gives us a list. And the list is there to remind us of what content we have in the scene, and it gives us special control over objects in our viewport. And then just beneath that, we have our attributes manager. And just to demonstrate some of the concepts in Cinema 4D, the first thing I want to do is I want to go find this cube object. And if I roll my mouse over it, it says add cube. And if I click and hold on that menu, you can see that I have the option to create different kinds of parametric primitives. So I got a couple different options here. If I go up to this cube and I just click one time on it, that generates a cube object. If I hit the delete key, it'll get rid of that cube, and if I click and hold on this object, I can choose a different kind of object like a sphere. I'll delete the sphere. I'm going to go back to the menu and I'm going to generate a cube, and I want to talk to you a little bit about the Cinema 4D interface now that we have some new information in it. The first thing you'll notice is in the perspective viewport, this is where all of our modeling and our scene rendering is going to happen. So currently we have this cube that's been generated, and you can see that there's three different axes that are presented in Cinema 4D. Now, the biggest kind of new concept, if you haven't worked inside a 3D space before, is that we have three-dimensional axes. So if you're used to working in Illustrator, or you're used to working in Photoshop or Premiere or InDesign, typically you're used to working with the y-axis or the up axis and the x-axis. So when you place content in Photoshop and Illustrator, you're moving it along a two-dimensional grid. In 3D space, we have the added benefit of having a third dimension, and our z, our blue axis, is our foreground background, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a bit. But you'll notice that we have this heads-up display that pops up, and when we have content inside our 3D scene, we can do things like we can roll our mouse over one of the axes, and we can click and drag and move this object up or down. I'll use Command Z or Edit Undo to get that object back to its original position. I can slide it in the foreground or background along the Z space, and I'll Command Z again, and of course I could use the X-axis as well. Now it's not so important that you understand which axis is which at this point, because there's a couple of things that will remind us. If we look down the bottom left-hand corner, Cinema 4D will give us a little heads up as to what our different axes are. We have our y-axis, which is always pointing up, our x-axis, which we can think of as kind of our left and right, and then our z-axis, which is in the foreground background. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a later presentation. Now if we look over here in the Objects Manager, this is the panel to the right of the perspective view, you can see that I have an object inside my scene, and it's called Cube. If I deselect my cube just by clicking in the negative space of the Cinema 4D viewport, you can see that it deselects the cube from the Object Manager. Now the Object Manager is going to be a very important window for us to pay attention to. And in fact, rather than creating some bad habits from the beginning, I want to give you some of the best habits when it comes to Cinema 4D. And one habit that you can establish early is that you'll notice that you can roll over a cube and click on it to select it in the viewport. And that can be pretty convenient and handy, but you can also select objects in the Object Manager. And once an object is selected, it'll show you all the parameters that govern that object in the Attributes Manager. Now we'll talk about the attributes here a little bit later, but for now what I want to do is just give you get you oriented to the space. We'll talk about navigating the space in the next presentation. So take a few minutes and generate a couple of different parametric primitives inside Cinema 4D and try to navigate, just move those objects around. Make sure that you're using the Object Manager to select the different objects. And we'll catch up in the next presentation and talk about some of the things that we're seeing in the Attributes Manager and a few other things to pay attention to in Cinema 4D so that we can start organizing content in space. And we'll do that in the next presentation.